Rent to own is a deal type that comes up every so often. This is kind of how it usually plays out. I'll be talking to a potential buyer for the first time or early in the process, and they'll ask me, do you have any rent to own properties listed for sale? They'll tell me their credit's not all that good, they don't have a lot of money saved up, and they just don't want to deal with a bank anyway. They had talked to a friend, the friend told them, rent to own is a great option because it's cheaper than going through the bank. The rent gets credited toward the purchase price, and you just don't have to deal with a bank at all. So there are at least 5 myths about rent to own wrapped into just those few sentences. I'm Dave with the Bolduc Realty Group. I'm a licensed Connecticut real estate broker, and I want to talk to you about what rent to own is right now. So first thing, what is rent to own and what is it not? Rent to own comes in 2 flavors. There's the lease purchase and the lease with option to purchase. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of difference. It's just one word, option to purchase. So what does that mean? Well, in both cases, there's a lease. And it's just like any other lease. It'll be usually 2 to 5 year term, and you'll have use of the property and you'll be paying rent during that time just like you would anywhere else. The second part of the agreement is either a purchase agreement or an option to purchase agreement. With a purchase agreement, you're obligated to purchase the house by contract, and there's going to be terms in there such as the purchase price that you will have to live by. With an option to purchase, it's a little bit different. Now, in this case, you have a choice. You don't have to purchase it. You can choose to purchase a house at the end or during the lease as it's written in the contract. That may not sound like a big difference, but it can make a huge difference, especially if after living there for a little while, you decide you don't want to live in that house anymore, or at the end of the lease, you don't have the financial wherewithal to actually buy the house. So what rent to own is not. Rent to own is not seller financing. In a rent to own, you're signing a lease and you're going to live at the house, renting it. With seller financing, you're actually taking possession of the house. There will be a transfer of the title, the deed will be written into your name, and you'll own the house. And in a seller financing, the seller becomes the bank. So they, for lack of a better term, they lend you the money to buy the house. So that's seller financing. In a rent to own, the seller still owns the house while it's leased. It's not until you actually purchase or execute the option to purchase that you take possession and the seller is out of the deal. Another thing that rent to own is not necessarily is a scam. The rent to own is real. I've done them. I know a lot of people that have done them. They work very, very well in the right conditions. But you have to be very, very carefully. Just like if you've ever heard about like Airbnb or VRBO scams where somebody goes online and they book a weekend at some super great place, and then they get there, find out somebody else is already staying there, and the person that they booked it with never had control of the property, never owned it. You could have the same type of thing happen in a rent to own. So you make sure that you get competent legal advice from an attorney when you're doing this work to make sure that the person who you are doing this rent to own activity with is someone who can actually sell the house. The third thing that it's not is for everyone. This is a very specific deal that's used in a very specific set of circumstances. It's not for everyone. There are a lot of risks and there are a lot of rewards, but you have to balance those and make sure that you're in the right place. And we'll talk about that as we go through the rest of the video. The first myth in that little scenario that I gave, are there any rent-to-own homes listed for sale, or do I have any? Well, most rent-to-own deals are organic. So there's a landlord that owns a property, they're ready to sell, but they, not really sure. The tenant, they don't want to disrupt the tenant. The tenant loves the place, but just doesn't have the credit or the money to make it happen right now. Maybe that landlord and tenant have a discussion. They enter into a rent-to-own agreement, having an attorney help them set that up. And over time, the tenant builds up the credit in order to buy the place. That's mostly the way rent-to-owns happen. There are some properties on the MLS where the seller's open to selling using a rent-to-own. They're few and far between. Most people are really looking for cash at closing, and the reason for that, they have to pay for the next house that they're going to be living in. There are some websites out there that do pitch themselves as having a list of rent-to-own properties in your neighborhood. Just check it out. Yeah, so you sign up, pay a bunch of money, and then maybe they have them, maybe they don't. Just read the fine print at the bottom, because usually it says, can't guarantee that we have any rent-to-owns in your neighborhood, blah, 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 blah. So just read that. I have done a little research on some of those and found them to be less than useful, let's say that. My advice, ask. You never know who's willing. Talk to your landlord. Talk to friends and family. Maybe they know somebody who would be willing to wait for their money in order to get some monthly income and know that someone's going to be taking over the house. There's always possibilities out there. Just make sure your expectations are realistic. Most people do not want to wait for their money. They want their cash at closing when they sell the house. The second myth in that little scenario I just walked through is you can sign a rent to own without having good credit or any money in the bank. So the poor credit might not be an issue up front, but the lack of cash definitely will be. You can expect to have to come up with a pretty sizable deposit when you sign the lease option or the lease purchase agreement. The security deposit that's typically taken when you lease a place, it doesn't really come into play here. The deposit that you do need to come up with is typically refundable. It can be pretty much any amount. I've seen between 5 to 10%, but it's what you negotiate. Think of it as an incentive for the seller to wait for their money. The deposit is typically credited toward the purchase price, but it's forfeit if you don't buy the house. The third myth in that little scenario is that you don't need to work with a bank when you're doing a rent to own. Just like when you rent an apartment, you don't need a bank to sign the lease. You also don't need the bank to sign that lease option up front or that lease purchase up front. But when you get to the end of the lease and it's time to purchase, you have to come up with some money somehow. Either you've earned enough cash that you can buy it cash, or you're going to have to go to the bank and get a loan. So the bank is not out of the equation, it's delayed. The purpose of that 2 to 5 year lease is to give you time to fix your credit, save up some money, do whatever you need to do in order to get a bank loan and buy the house. Remember, rent to own is not seller financing. The seller does expect you to eventually buy out the house at the price that you agreed upon. The fourth myth is that the rent is credited toward the purchase price. While this may be the case, you have to read the agreement that you're signing. I recommend getting an attorney to take a look at any agreement before you sign it. Typically, the monthly rent on a rent-to-own house is at or above the market rate. This is part of the incentive for that seller to hold on and wait for their money. Keep that in mind. The rent is non-refundable. It's just like any other rent you are paying to any other landlord when you're renting a property. That rent is typically used to pay for a mortgage, taxes, insurance, anything like that. Some agreements allow and some also require you to pay extra above that rent, and that is credited toward the purchase price. So this means that your rent's going to be even higher, and that extra amount usually doesn't add up to too much. Say you're going to pay an extra $200 a month. That's $2,400 a year. Over a 2-year lease, that's only $4,800, a little less than $5,000. The extra rent is typically not refundable if you don't purchase the house. So another thing to pay attention to. The fifth myth is that rent-to-owns are cheaper than buying with a bank loan. Warning, this one does have some math in it, so be prepared. Rent-to-own is typically not the cheapest way to buy a house. Remember what I said about the rent is usually higher than the market rate? We also need to take into account the difference in down payments and fees and things of that nature. So let's set up a little scenario and walk through it and you can see what I mean. So let's say the house purchase price is $300,000. In a rent to own, let's say your rent is $2,300 a month, which is possible around here, and you're going to pay an extra $200 a month toward the purchase of the house. So that's $2,500 a month in rent total in the lease 2 years. So over those 2 years, you're going to pay $60,000 in rent. Now remember, $200 per month or $4,800 of that $60,000 is going toward the purchase price. Just keep that in mind. You're going to have a non-refundable deposit of 15%, which is $15,000. And you're going to have some attorney's fees, because I always recommend you have any legal document like this, you have an attorney of your own read through it. So say that's $1,000, right? So now your cost to start the rent to own is $16,000. The deposit plus the attorney's fee. Both of those are not refundable. Let's talk about a bank. So the bank, you're going to say you're getting a FHA loan, 3.5% down. So the down payment is $10,500. Then your closing costs, I usually use about 3%, maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower, but a good estimate is about 3% for closing costs. So that's another $9,000. So that's $19,500. So rent to own right now, it looks like the better deal, right? $16,000 versus $19,500. We're not done yet because we got to go through the entire process, and we got to take into account rents and everything else. So let's do that right now. So if you go all the way to the end of the lease, the 2-year lease, you'll have paid $60,000 in rent, right? 24 months at $2,500 each. The amount that's credited toward the purchase price is $4,800. And the closing costs from the bank, because remember I said you got to use a bank loan at the end to buy out. So now you got to pay 3% of that remaining. You're taking the $15,000 off and the $4,800 off. The remaining, so your closing costs are going to be about $8,400. So your total out of pocket for the entire deal, the $16,000 up front that we already talked about, and then $60,000 in rent and $8,406, that's a total of $84,406. Now, if you use the bank at the beginning, 2 years later, you'll have paid mortgages, you'll pay taxes, all this stuff. So we need to take that into account to have an apples to apples comparison here. So the mortgage payments at a 30-year loan at 6.7% is $1,900. That's just principal and interest. And then let's assume the taxes are $5,000 per year. So that's $10,000 for 2 years. So your total out of pocket is the $19,500 when you first bought the house, deposit plus closing costs, and then $45,600 in mortgage payments and $10,000 in taxes. So you're at $75,100. That's less. That's actually $9,000 less. So what's going on here? It's because rent-to-owns are typically more expensive. And that's it for the math. This example that I just gave doesn't include the debt pay down that you on the bank loan over those 2 years. So you're earning a little bit of equity. If the buyer can get a down payment assistance program, or they can do a 0% down loan, say like a VA loan, a USDA loan, and there are even some FHA loans like that, then the amount that they have to come up with the bank loan is even less. Because remember, the down payment that they had to make was $10,500. If they could do a 0% down, finance that whole thing, well, then their payments go up a little bit, but they don't have to come up with the $10,500 right out of the gate. Those are the myths. So why would you do a rent-to-own? Rent-to-own is the tool that is used in very specific circumstances. The right conditions are when you have money in the bank, but not the best credit. You got to do some work. You got to get something fixed. And you can't get a bank loan because of that. Rent-to-own allows you to get into a house and start making it your own house while you are fixing your credit and getting yourself into a position where you can get a bank loan and then end up purchasing the house. So assuming you had a successful rent-to-own and you're able to get a bank loan, purchase the house, the title comes into your name, you've got the house, congratulations, it worked out perfect. Let's talk about what happens on the other side. If you decide that you don't want to buy the house or you can't buy the house for some reason, then there's some issues here. If you did a lease purchase agreement, there's some contractual issues that you're going to have to talk to an attorney about to figure out how to address. If you're doing a lease option, you have a choice. You don't have to make the purchase. Either way, the details and specifics are going to be in the documents. Talk to an attorney. Generally, when the lease ends, you're going to have to move out. The non-refundable deposit you gave is just that. It's non-refundable. You're not getting it back. The rent that you paid is just like any other rent. It's non-refundable. You're not getting it back. If you paid extra that's supposed to be credited toward the purchase price, that may or may not be refundable. You have to refer to your documentation on that. Typically on these on rent-to-owns, that renter buyer is responsible for all maintenance. So any maintenance that you did, any upgrades, anything like that, you're not going to be able to get that back. That's non-refundable. And additionally, if you don't maintain things and the owner comes back and finds that there's problems, they might be able to come after you to have that fixed. So this is some of the ugly side of a rent-to-own. It's something you need to be aware of when you're looking to do a rent-to-own. Under the right circumstances, rent-to-own can be a great path to ownership. Just make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into and what you're signing up for. Buying a house is a major decision. Make sure that you have a strong team by your side who's going to guide you through the real estate maze and make sure that you avoid any pitfalls that are out there. I'm Dave with the Bold Oak Realty Group. Thanks for checking this video out. Have a great day.